Hey everyone, let's jump straight into the midterm. I'm at Module 6 at 6.5, and I want to make sure that we go over this midterm essay organizing worksheet. Like your first worksheet, it's not the assignment itself, but hopefully gives you a strong vision in writing an essay that's worth 20 points that hits around 9 major ideas. All right, so let's go ahead and click on this worksheet. And as you could see, we're really interested in comparing three groups. We're looking at evidence that relates them to citizenship. We know that citizenship itself has a strong relationship to the making of race in America. And so we'll be taking a look at evidence, labor and law again, and then we're always going to circle back to our concepts and theories and take a look at how these events and these experiences led to comparative racialization as different people. I think the case can be made that some of these folks could be considered part of the same groups. Some of these folks can be considered part of existing racial groups. And so our question is, how do these groups kind of become different racial groups altogether after the revolution? And we know this is going to be contingent on that 1790 citizenship law, as y'all discussed in your forums, that really made restrictions of free and white as precursors to American citizenship. And so, as you're reading the Zinn text, I want you to make sure that you're looking at evidence that might imply that Native Americans are not going to be considered white. A quick Google search will turn out that Native Americans won't be able to vote and have citizenship until 1924, but get into that Zinn text and find me evidence that things are happening that are shaping Native American experiences as experiences that are not going to be inclusive. And so you're going to see things like Native Americans won't be able to testify in court against white folks. You're going to see Native Americans really try to make efforts to some degree in assimilating into southern states, but still you're going to see a whole bunch of experiences, particularly laws that are related to land allotment and removal, that are going to put Native Americans on reservations that are overseen by the federal government at around 1824 and beyond. So, really find that evidence that really kind of suggests that Native Americans are not moving towards American citizenship, are not moving towards whiteness, and therefore are being moved into an altogether new racial category that's really actually not being counted by the United States Census. If we move on to Latinos and Mexican Americans, we have another interesting experience in which borders are actually crossing Latinos, borders are crossing Mexican Americans. Although we often relate the Mexican American experience to that of immigration, you can kind of see here through the Zinn text and through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that actually they're not crossing borders at all. Borders are in fact crossing them. And if you're reading the Zinn text, you're reading things like this is a group of people that have a ton of indigenous ancestry. And so the question is, will they be racialized as Native American people, given reservations, and be overseen through the federal government? The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo will say no, and you'll see that actually Mexican Americans will have access to citizenship. You're just going to have to draw that out of the treaty, and you're going to have to give me that evidence. And so a lot of these things certainly are historical facts that are found on the internet, but what I'm looking for is I'm looking for the primary source evidence or the secondary source evidence. Secondary meaning book, primary meaning an actual document itself, like the treaty. And so for Asian Americans, you're reading through the Takaki text, and this is a group that are in fact crossing borders, and they're free. In some cases, their physical appearances may look different, but if you think about things like color, the question of whether or not Asian Americans would join white Americans, European Americans, as free laborers is a question that I think has to be answered. And so you're going to be taking a look at laws. The Takaki reading is full of laws that really imply that Asian Americans will not be citizens. You got to find me that evidence. And overall, you want to kind of circle back to the larger theoretical concerns of why these groups are not just racialized as different from black and white, but also different from each other. And so I want to close this midterm worksheet for just a second and head to something that I think is a useful tool in comparing the three groups against each other. And so let me head back to my modules really quickly here. And I want to scroll down to module 6 one more time. And I think that racial triangulation is going to be a concept that can really, really help us. And so let me go ahead and click on 6.3, go backwards a little bit. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and open up this resource. And so this is an excerpt from the Takaki reading. I'll just read it really quickly, and then from there, we'll go into racial triangulation. So after the railroad experience, planters soon saw that Chinese could be employed as models for black workers. And so, again, one of the things that we're seeing is that labor is going to separate the Chinese and the black folks against each other. The theoretical, hardworking, and frugal Chinese would be the educators of former slaves. And you can kind of see here that in many ways, the Chinese are used to discipline black workers who are coming out of emancipation. This is going to be our topic for next week. And so during the 1870s, Mississippi and Louisiana imported several hundred Chinese workers and pitted them against black workers. They praised the foreign workers for outproducing blacks, for regulating the detestable system of black labor. And you can kind of see here that even a governor explained the underlying motive for this effort to bring in Chinese workers was to punish the Negro for having abandoned the control of his old master and to regulate the conditions of his employment and scale the wages to be paid to him. So in this case, in the Takaki reading, what you're seeing is that Chinese workers are being pitted against black workers and their positions of labor, one coming out of slavery, the other bringing in, right, free bodies for work, but not getting paid as much as white workers and disciplining black workers. You can see that racialization right here is comparatively taking place. And so let's scroll down to the second half of this resource really quickly here. And let's get into what Claire Jean Kim calls racial triangulation. And so this model kind of takes a look at the ways that people are going to be triangulated in between black and white as they move into the United States or they're being annexed into the United States. And so the bottom scale, this axis here, is an axis that represents foreign versus insiders. You can kind of see this as folks that are considered either citizens or considered, right, property in this case of citizens. And you can see that the idea that black folks are insiders is clear considering a lot of southern plantation owners still necessitate black labor in order to run this agriculture even after emancipation. The difference between black and white, however, is power, right? And so we here see that economic power, cultural power, political power, social power, it's all in the hands of free whites. And you can kind of see here that Claire Jean Kim kind of implies that white and black is kind of considered insiders to America, not to be expelled out of America. Whereas Asian Americans are coming in and they're fitting somewhere in between black and whites as far as power. They're certainly getting paid more than black folks as they're working on things like railroads and mines and agriculture, but they're getting paid a lot less than whites who are now forming unions that are exclusive to European Americans. Asian Americans, however, are considered foreign. And so part of the reasons why we're seeing them not join either the black or white existing racial groups is because of their quote unquote foreignness, their ineligibility to citizenship, and their perceived differences, what earlier on we talked about folks were calling Orientalism. And so racial triangulation is the idea that people are not actually racialized in a vacuum. They're always racialized in comparison to one another. And so find some evidence that this is the case here, right? The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is a treaty that implies that Latinos start somewhere around here, particularly wealthy Spanish landowners. You'll see in our class that Latinos will eventually be triangulated outwards, right? To the point where in many ways we consider them immigrant groups now, and that will kind of reconstruct their racial identities. And so I'm going to close this resource really quickly here, and I'll go back to our modules, and I'll close out by just investigating this treaty really quickly with you as we move backwards. And so you could see here that I also provided the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which I fully expect to be in this midterm somewhere as evidence for you. And you can kind of see here that there are clauses in Article 8 that really reflect this idea of the ability of Mexican citizens to acquire citizenship in the United States. So this is going to make them uniquely different from Native Americans, even though they have indigenous upbringings. It's going to make them uniquely different from Chinese Americans who are not eligible to citizenship. But there's going to be something that you're going to see that really triangulates them away from this idea of both cultural and political inclusion that a lot of white Europeans are now getting, right? And so you'll read through the Zinn text, you'll take a look at how the war is racializing Mexican Americans, and you'll kind of see that even though Mexicans are given citizenship, they're actually being treated with a lot of social discrimination. And so when you think about these three major groups, make sure you're including Zinn, make sure you're including Takaki, make sure that you're making some references to some of the concepts, racial formation, racial triangulation, right? Make sure that you're finding evidence for that 1790 naturalization law and will they become citizens? And then overall compare them and really answer the question, how are they being racialized against each other? And why are they being put into altogether different racial groups? Good luck, and I'll see you in this assignment.